I want my grandchildren or children to have a home. But if that home has a neighbor who constantly hits in your walls throughout the night and occasionally threatens you with a knife, and you might and cuts your pipes, so you have floods in your house, with all your desire to live in the house, you say, you know what, to hell with it. My children's future is more important than that.
History has shown us time and time again that when the Jewish people unite, we're able to overcome. Join the My Israel Narrative Achdut series as we sit down with individuals from across the aisle, Democrat and Republican, religious and secular, Sephardi and Ashkenaz, Israeli and diaspora, to unpack these differences, to see how despite those differences, we are one. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of My Israel Narrative. I'm very excited to be kicking off our new series focused on what we're coining Practical Achdut with two amazing individuals, the Kandels, Daniela and Eugene, father and daughter duo. It's very cool to see that and to see, when a father and daughter together can build something really amazing. Just by way of brief introduction, and I'll get into specifically what we're here to talk about in a minute, but by way of brief introduction, Daniela is CEO of the Evergreen Innovation Platform, as well as interim CEO of the Israel Strategic Futures Institute, which we're going to discuss in more depth today on the podcast. And Eugene wears many hats: a professor, writer, advisor. The many things I picked up just having heard from you a few months back, and your impressive trail that you've left in your career to date. And also serving as CEO and founder of the Israel Strategic Future Institute, which is really working towards what I see as a perfectly clear example of trying to reach this place of practical achdut, of taking the many challenges that Israel is facing, both externally as well as very much internally, and trying to take that, not just sit on the sidelines and watch it continue to unfold, but to say we have a responsibility to do something. You both obviously have experience and an understanding and a knowledge base of how to at least start to offer up solutions and involve the greater public. And I'm just excited to learn more from both of you, and to also share with our listeners how, where the responsibility lies beyond just within this organization and the two of you, and how we can activate more of the Jewish people to get behind an amazing cause. So with that, I just want to hand it off respectfully. Maybe Danielle, if you want to kick us off, and Eugene, if there's anything else you want to share about yourself, and then we'll dive in a little deeper to what you're both doing.
Thanks, Izzy. Yeah. So first of all, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be here and have this conversation with you. It's really an important one to us. The only thing I would add, I have been an entrepreneur in the climate space for the last 4 years. And I spent my career always in the double bottom line impact investment at scale, the business models and technologies. And following the events of October 7th, it was very clear that we need to bring ourselves and focus on this really, really pressing challenge, making sure that Israel has a future that we can see ourselves and our children and grandchildren part of. So bit of a shift in my career, and that's why I'm the interim CEO, as we're built on a volunteer basis, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So it's a pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. And Eugene, a few words.
So, hi, Izzy. Thank you for having us. This is always fun to be with Daniela in the same anything. Even though we divided, she lives in New York and I live near Jerusalem. We are. Any opportunity to do something together with her, which is now been given, is great. So my background is quite diverse. I was born in Moscow, Soviet Union. I immigrated after being refuseniks, my parents being refuseniks, in 1977 to Israel. I've spent 4 years in Israeli military. I studied at Hebrew University. I went to University of Chicago to do my MBA and PhD. I was a professor at the University of Rochester, and then for 27 years, professor at the Hebrew University again. I spent 6 years as the head of the National Economic Council and economic advisor to the Prime Minister. Then I spent 6 years as the CEO of Startup Nation Central, which is a nonprofit focused on Israeli technology. Now I'm chairing a think tank called RISE. I'm the chairman of the board of Tel Aviv Stock Exchange, and this is a new endeavor that Daniela has launched and basically forced us to launch it because she wanted action. And this is, I think this one is the most important one. But the interesting thing is that I bring all these experiences from 3 different countries, from 4 different careers into this whole thing, looking at the future of Israel. And if you ask people about the future of Israel, they say, well, if we just deal with Iran and maybe with Hamas and maybe with Hezbollah, it'll be okay. And so what we are saying is that it won't be. It's actually a relatively significant probability that we might implode this country like we did twice in our history yet again. Because what happens, increasingly happens to us, is that our population has changed dramatically. The composition of the population has changed dramatically in the last 80 years. Just to give you an example, Ben-Gurion thought that Haredi population will disappear within a decade from the establishment of the State of Israel. And so he was very, basically dismissive of giving them all kinds of things that he said that it won't last. Well, today they're 15% of the population, and in probably 25 years there will be a third of the Israeli population. So it just indicates how much the Israeli population has changed, and yet the system that governs us, that allows us to interact, has not changed at all. What was perhaps a reasonable system for when Ben-Gurion and others set it up it has actually became a problem. Became a problem, and not just a problem, but a very significant problem for us, because what it does, given the population differences and very, very different visions and sets of values that different parts of population possess, the current system of governance of Israel basically forces us to fight each other. It's not a solution, it's the problem. And the reason is very simple. If I believe in certain vision for Israel or certain way of life, and the only way I can ensure my ability for that way of life that contradicts some other people's way of life or desired way of life, I have to gain control of the Knesset, and then I can legislate my way of life. The problem is that then my way of life applies to everybody, including people who don't want it or really oppose it. And so when you have groups with incompatible visions and values and ways of life that they want for themselves, the system, the unitary system that we have, is a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for culture war. It's a recipe for economic war with each other. And it's a very fertile ground for politicians to partition us along various lines and utilize that. In Hebrew, the word party, just like in English, party is from the word to part. In Hebrew, the word miflaga, which is the party in Hebrew, is from the word to divide. Divide, not divide like 6 divided by 3. It's divide when you go this way and I go that way. It's the more we divided, the better the politics are. So that's the immediate result of the system of governance that we have. And so 1 + 1 = 2. If you have a population that cannot agree on basically anything in terms of vision and values, and you have a system of governance that forces everybody to have the same one set of laws, you have a war. And since we can, sorry, go ahead.
No, I wanted to just on that point specifically. Can you maybe compare and contrast? Is it by nature because of the people of Israel themselves that we need such a different type of government structure, or by comparison, did we just pick the wrong structure altogether? Can you compare the way that American society and our government structure functions versus Israeli society and the Israeli government, and why? Here, okay, yes, we have our own problems, don't get me wrong, but it's not, we've gotten to the point of close to civil war, people infighting, but it's not to the same extent. So what is different and what is the same?
There's a perfect example of that. And I know the challenges that American politics, and there's division, etc. But if you're a progressive left-wing person, you have a bunch of states to which you can go and find dominance of like-minded people in those states. If you're much more conservative or Republican or MAGA or whatever you are, person, you can find states. There are 50 states in the US. You can find states where the majority fit your set of values. Now imagine that the United States was a unitary government, and the entire set of laws governing your day-to-day life, including abortion, arms, immigrants, everything, had to be decided only once in Washington. It's high likelihood that people would have a civil war, because you can't agree on anything, basically. People from, I don't know, I'm just saying, it's actually Micha Goodman's point, that he has relatives in Massachusetts and he has relatives in Oklahoma. And they cannot agree on anything, basically, like literally on anything. When he visits those, they say A. When he visits those, they say B. And A and B are mutually exclusive. But because they have Massachusetts, where the majority of people actually say B, and you have Oklahoma, where the majority of people say A, and they all agree about A, you don't have these people fight each other. Right. That's not the case in Israel. In Israel, you have A and B, and we basically cannot think about the following. You have a whole group of people who but who must have a liberal democracy, and who must be able to define their Jewishness or their Judaism any way they want. Okay, they want that right. Okay, and they want liberal democracy, not in a sense of liberal democracy of progressive woke in the US or in other countries, but liberal democracy as Hume and Mills 300 years ago defined. Okay, with protection for minorities, due process, etc., separation of powers. And so they must have it in their future. And if they don't have it for their children, then they cannot stay. On the other hand, you have a group, no less legitimate group, that says we cannot accept liberal democracy as a concept. Why? Because anytime liberal democracy contradicts the Torah law as interpreted by my rabbi, Torah law wins every time. There's no question about it. And by the way, there's only one way of being Jewish. You cannot be Jewish any other way. Otherwise, you basically, either you're Epicorus or you're not Jewish at all. And so you cannot have a compromise between these two groups. Both of them legitimate, in a sense, because they just start from different axioms.
Right.
But they cannot agree on values in any way. They cannot have, and each one of them, none of them wants to, majority of them do not want to fight. They don't want to impose. They don't want to attack. They don't feel they're attacking anybody. But they are protecting. But when you're protecting your way of life through the legal system, you're imposing your laws that are consistent with your way of life on everybody else. For everybody else, you're attacking them, and they're protecting themselves, which you see as they attacking you. And so there's no way out of this, because we can't agree on values, and the system that imposes the condition that everybody has to live under the same set of laws basically structurally forces us to fight. Add to that the economic war, which is basically saying, look, the Minister Goldknopf of the ultra-religious party, what's it, Yadut, what is it called? Yadut Torah, said, we're going to decide how we live, and you're going to pay for it. That is a very reasonable statement if the payment is small. And we saying, like, if they were Amish and there were tiny percent of the population, they demanded to be subsidized, which Amish actually don't, that would be fine. So 20, 30 years ago, it was fine because the population was very small. But when you're 15% of the population, and in 20 years, 25 years, you're going to be 30% of the population, saying that I'm not going to participate in creating value, creating GDP, and so everybody else will have to pay me for my lifestyle. That is just non-sustainable. And it's not sustainable within less than 2 decades. Because it just says that people who are creating, who are productive, who pay taxes, have to subsidize families that is other than their own. And it's not individually, but as a group. Because remember, the welfare state was founded on the premise that it's a safety net that's supposed to catch people that fall through the cracks individually. And then you catch them, you help them, and you send them back, or you maintain their lifestyle or reasonable lifestyle if they can't go back to the labor force. But when a large group of people, 15% of the population or so, says, you know what, we're just going to jump to the safety net together. And we're going to be jumping on that safety net despite the fact that we might be 30% of the population, 40%, doesn't matter. We still want that safety net. That safety net not going to hold. It's a very, very simple calculation that we can show, and you don't have to have a PhD in economics to see that it doesn't work. And before October 7th, we were estimating that we have maybe 25, 30 years to fix this. After October 7th, we maybe have 15, because the same population that subsidizes both the Haredi population, the Arab population today, is now having to pay about additional 400 billion shekels in the next 10 years related to the war. So this population is on the brink of saying, you know what, with all my Zionism, with all my desire to live here and raise children, there is a group of people that is going to impose their values on me, on my children, which I don't want. I'm not going to live in a non-democratic, non-liberal democracy society. They want me to pay for them, and they want me to protect them and serve in the military. So it's not a criticism of religious people in no way. They have the rights to their own views, opinions, values, and visions. But the current situation is clearly not sustainable. And it's like an autoimmune disease of a body. It doesn't really matter whether red cells or white cells or T cells won. The main point is the body died. Okay, that's the problem that we're facing, and we have to address this pretty quickly.
As I say, before we get deeper into the technicalities, I'm just curious, also from because I find it to be quite inspiring from both of you, and Daniela, you know, Eugene was really saying that this was really you who came to the plate and said, you know, I want to do something. So I wanted to just jump in quickly and Daniela, ask from your vantage point, your perspective. Obviously, you were watching this trajectory, you were watching all of this unfold, both of you, within the fabric of Israeli society pre-October 7th. What was really, you know, that flip of the switch where you said, okay, something needs to be done, and I'm going to do something. And then how did you even know where to start? Because something like this, I mean, you're not talking about
just starting a little, or, it's a national movement, international movement for the Jewish people in a way?
So the truth of the matter is, Eugene had been working on this for, I think it's close to 5 years now, 4.5, 5 years. And he was part, and as his daughter, I got to see this and sit on the sidelines and watch, and I'm very privileged to have him send me sometimes things to give him feedback on. So he had started this research that was really looking at what are the strategic risks for Israel. And it started from a purely economic perspective. And then, and during this time, I actually moved out of Israel in 2022. So I was watching everything unravel from afar, which was very difficult. Every time I came, you experience it suddenly as a wave of change in the sentiment, in how people are talking about each other, about the country. So actually seeing it in increments every few months. When I moved, I was in Israel every other month, basically. And so when that started to happen, I know Eugene pulled in his co-founder, actually, in our work in Ronsu. And they started looking also at the social aspects, the governing aspects, really trying to analyze what are the existential risks for Israel in the broader perspective, looking at what was happening in 2023. And as they were looking at this, they were continuously developing this paper about the existential risks to Israel and what it means to think about risk mitigation, what we need to be doing. And as Eugene mentioned, before the war, and I know they were about to publish actually the work right before October 4th, Eugene and Ron, I have the video, so I know, they actually recorded themselves talking about these risks and what it would mean and potentially what the worst case scenario could look like. I don't think even then they were thinking of anything in the level of October 7th. I don't think any of us thought that was possible. But October 4th, they were releasing they were recording to release this report that was looking straight into the eyes of what are our internal challenges, what are the risks, and what it looks like. And in that report, we still had time, because economically, as Eugene said, the demographic trends are generally slow enough that we believe that we have 25 to 30 years to fix things economically, which also meant socially, so there was time to change. What happened following October 7th is there's the economic burden, but then there's the personal burden of the miluimnikim and the military and the reserves, and also I think what happened, and for me in the U.S. looking at Israel, which is a completely different kind of trauma, I think, that we were experiencing outside of Israel. But looking at what was happening, maintaining hope, maintaining a positive outlook on where we're going as a country, was very, very difficult in the first months. And I was part of the different scenario plannings for Israel. What are the key parameters to sustain our future? And January 1st, 2024, 3 months later, I sat down and I realized that where I am pulling my hope, my optimism, my hope from, was this paper that Eugene and Ron had been working on. And I had been sort of, again, reading through, again, relatively passively and disconnected until that point. I realized that this was a pragmatic, serious look at what are the problems and how we solve them. And it also gave me back not only hope, but I understood that we can do something about it. And so on January 1st, 2024, I sat down and I wrote literally a proposal that I sent to Eugene and asked him to send to Ron. I said, what if we take this from research and we actually drive a movement? I don't see anyone that's doing this. No one is really seriously, pragmatically looking at what needs to change. Not many people have the experience from within the government and externally to talk about these kinds of changes and have the gravitas and experience to understand what it would mean to implement them. And so I sent it to them, and following that we had a conversation where I asked them if they would be comfortable that we would found this entity. They would be the board, they would be the chair people, and I would start running forward with this. And I got sort of their blessing. So really wholeheartedly planning to stay in the back, in the back of most of this initiative. This is sort of the first time we're recording publicly with me here, because it's a movement in Israel for Israel. But there is a role for the Jewish world and for Israelis and Jews outside of Israel. And I plan to continue to be very, very involved. But the leadership has to be in Israel. And that's why I don't like being the front of this. But I realized that we have to move the conversation to a conversation of what we can do, not just theoretically what is a solution, but what we can do and how we drive change to ensure our future. And then it was 25 years. Now we're looking at 15 years, and that's a best case scenario, because what we're really worried about, and Eugene was alluding to this, but what we're really worried about is a run on the country. And what that looks like, or what that means, is we're worried that enough people will lose hope about their future in Israel, about their children's future in Israel. And they will move to prioritizing their safety, their future, their values, and move out of Israel. And if enough people do that, and it's all based on perception, right? And Eugene can give the example from the financial world with the run on the bank, but it's all based on perception. Enough people lose hope. Enough people leave at once. Israel is not strong enough economically. We don't have enough people to sustain something like that. And Israel will no longer be economically viable if the tax base leaves. And it's not a single point in time that we know when that's going to happen. But it's definitely a very, very, very clear risk and a clear trajectory that is starting to happen. People are starting to think about it. People are, they're getting their passports and they're looking outside. And again, it's a very irrational response to the trauma and the reality that has unfolded since with the war.
It became an acceptable dinner conversation in many, many, many families.
To talk about leaving.
Yes, and not only talk about leaving, but discussing where it's better, where what are they? People are talking about preparing their children for the possibility that they would need to leave if their children do not have a foreign passport. There are other ways to get them to leave. For example, to send them to foreign universities, or to create a platform for them to land elsewhere. This is scary.
So that to me is probably the scariest thing of anything you've pointed out, and I'll tell you
We agree.
And I don't think otherwise. And I want to make sure, obviously, coming across in this conversation, one of the main topics I discussed for a while on this podcast was the idea of home and what that means. And when we're not living in Israel, but we call it a home, and people that do live there maybe don't see it, right? And it's this complicated. I mean, it's complicated, but it's not. For me, it's not complicated. Israel is home. That's where I hope to build my future, please God, very, very soon. I tried, already made Aliyah, I came back, and that's a whole other separate conversation. But I did
Aliyah twice, so you have hope.
Okay, so there's hope. I always tell this because I think it's very funny. I went back to Israel 2 months after I left. I left right around October 7th, unrelated, and then came back in December. And I was in the airport in Newark here, and the El, the gentleman who was questioning me, Israeli, you're just like, I'm sweating even though I have nothing to hide. And he basically said, so where do you live? And I said, now I'm here. And I was still confused at the time. So I said, yeah, New York. And he said, you gave up already. I said, what are you telling me? I gave up already. You're the one standing here in New York from Israel. So anyways, that's always it gives me a little chuckle. But very much the focus is to go back there. And I'm sitting here, I'm in the middle of New York City. I mean, I'm not a prophet. I can't tell you where things are going to go, what's going to be, but it's not looking so great here either. When I hear Israelis telling me they're trying to leave Israel to come to the diaspora at a time like this, I mean, my mind is just completely flipped upside down. And what I always tell also to people here in America is, the community that I'm a part of especially is, if you want to put your money somewhere, like I still really believe it's there. And what I believe is that if you don't see something working, then you have to go and do something about it. If you don't feel, which is what you both are doing, which is why I find it so inspiring, and I wanted to bring you into this conversation and have this conversation, because at the end of the day, do I think America is perfect and has everything, And I think as an Israeli, you miss that because you're so stuck, and it makes sense. You're so stuck in your own doubt and your own problems and in what's happening on a day to day and affecting you on a day to day. You don't even have time to start thinking, oh, what would be the problems if I went to America, if I went to Europe? I mean, the chief rabbi of France said there is no future for French Jews. So, and that doesn't, and we live in a global world now. That doesn't mean France alone. Like it doesn't work like that anymore. We live in a global world. After October 7th, the entire world was facing an uprising in anti-Semitism. So for me, hearing that
is too easy, but you know there is something that happened in there are three things that happened on November 7th in terms of people's perception. People told us, well, now all of your stuff is no longer relevant because we're now united, etc. We said, okay, let's wait 3 months and see whether it's true. Within 3 months, we were no longer united. Apart from people who were fighting in Gaza or in Lebanon, they were united the minute they got their uniform off. They were not united. The second thing that happened is that a lot of people in Israel lost their faith in the ability of the state to protect them, which was an absolute axiom until October 7th. That is extremely scary, and that will last for a while. And the third part that happened was the outburst of anti-Semitism outside. So that delayed a little bit. Because if only the first two happened, you would have seen a much bigger exodus very quickly. The problem is that the outburst of anti-Semitism will die down. It won't disappear. But if you look on the October 6th, you wouldn't have been saying that we're living in a highly anti-Semitic society. A lot of people on October 8th, they realized that they live in a world which in many cases, many of their so-called friends or associates really hate them for saying something, for being who they are. And so that was, if you listen to Scott Galloway, for example, he said, if you would tell me that I live in an anti-Semitic society on October 6th, I would have laughed at you. Today, I'm in a completely different space. So, this is a Jew who was completely assimilated into the general population, and did not see himself as anything special because he was Jewish. So, but the anti-Semitism will die down. The outbursts will die down, and we will forget. And even if anti-Semitism is still alive and kicking, which is going to be the case, you were talking about home. The home is where you want to be. And the reason that I'm dealing with this is that I want my grandchildren to have a country to live in, because I made Aliyah twice, once from Soviet Union with my parents, and second time from United States exactly 20 years later with my children. And so I want my grandchildren and children to have a home. But if that home has a neighbor who constantly hits your walls throughout the night and occasionally threatens you with a knife, and you might and cuts your pipes, so you have floods in your house, with all your desire to live in the house, you say, you know what, to hell with it. My children's future is more important than that. Even if in other home they like the less. That's the problem. And the point is that I don't have to wait until my neighbor threatens me with a knife or with a law that prohibits me from walking out of my house safely. I just need to anticipate that. And that is the scary part, is that we never know. People say, well, but what, there are no laws that restrict you. But the anticipation of those laws, anticipation of the value coercion and economic coercion, that will happen because demography is moving there, is going to ruin my chances of being there. And I don't want to let not I, but a person can say, look, I'd rather have my grandchild grow in another place where he or she will feel reasonably at home when they grow up, like you did 5 years ago or 3 years ago. You still wanted to be in Israel, etc. But if you were growing in a less, um, let's say, observant society, and you were living in a family that was relatively assimilated, you would have not known that you lived in a country where there was anti-Semitism. You would not have brushed against it, especially if you were in large areas with large Jewish population.
I would just add that I think the perception when you live in Israel and are Israeli versus the perception when you're outside of Israel as what are the risks and what are the realities of those risks differs very, very much. And I have to say, living in Israel, even before October 7th, you take so much of it for granted. I took my Jewish, culture for granted, my surrounding for granted, my safety for granted, what it means that, Jewish holidays are the holidays in the country. Like suddenly I'm in the US and I forgot that it's Rosh Hashanah, and suddenly I literally missed Rosh Hashanah in my first year, almost a few days before we noticed it was happening. But it's so, there's so many privileges that you get to see and enjoy that then when you move away, you sort of learn to appreciate them. And I think that's the challenge and the opportunity, right? For Israelis, because they're focused on what they have and they don't appreciate it as much as we do. They don't appreciate their safety. They don't appreciate the land of the Jews. And I'm not saying that they don't appreciate it at all, but it's not the same level as looking from it from the outside. And at the same time, I'll also say that post October 7th, anti-Semitism is something that they're aware of, but it's not a risk to them. I think it's so much less scary to an Israeli than the bomb, than the thought of another October 7th, and the thought of not being able to protect ourselves in a group, trusting in a system. Basically when you move outside of Israel, you decide to protect yourself and create a community that you think will protect you together. You basically decide to rebuild. In Israel, you have to trust that the country that was built will protect you. And an interesting example, again, living outside of Israel, I've been following October 7th and anti-Semitism, right, immediately. I was shocked by it, and I was also seeing it all the time when I was here. Because I was here, I think, to an extent. It was, during the beginning of the war, the first months, no one in Israel, it's not that they didn't care, they heard about it, but that wasn't the top priority. There was so much, and still is so much going on in the day-to-day reality. So I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, I saw Bennett, one of the politicians in Israel, post something about his shock on anti-Semitism and what's happening in campuses outside. I just saw October 8th, the movie, the documentary that came out, and it's all things that we've been following for the last year and a half. It's very much part of our reality since October 7th. And in Israel, they're only, I think, waking up to understand a little bit what that means, but I don't think an Israeli understands really what anti-Semitism is. Not in the same way. It's historical trauma, but it's not as alive in their reality.
I think it's also something that you have to, I see it with my father's an immigrant from Iran, my mother as well, but she came much earlier, and in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, so I came back from Israel, and I was very hot on, I didn't leave Israel because I felt unsafe. I left because it made sense for me before the fact, and I very much still see it as a place that I'm going back to and has much more of a viable future for me than America. That has been my standpoint and hasn't really changed. And I get why Israelis don't have the capacity to think about it, because your mind psychologically can only bear so much trauma and so much stress to it at a certain point in time. For my father, he's still experiencing the trauma and the stress of having to leave everything behind. Granted, in a very different way than the Holocaust. We're not here to compare, what different sects of Jews went through, but he very much went through his own trauma, and he doesn't have the brain capacity or the space. I see a lot of people don't, to now process this new. I even mentioned going to see the film, and he just said to me very straight, I can't. I don't think I can watch that. I don't think I want to see. I know, and I don't want to see anymore. So I always said this middle axiom of like, how much, even right now in this conversation, how much do I want to talk about the problem and ingrain it more of like, go tell Israelis how bad it really is in America. You think there's a future here? I don't believe there is. Why are you coming here? Like, how much to focus on that versus flipping the switch? And it's kind of why I'm hoping to take the conversation also, because that'll also take us to the point of how we can get people outside of Israel involved of, okay, so what are we going to do about it? What is the real practical, so that it doesn't get to the point where Israelis are now having to think, I need to get out, and maybe pick, the lesser of the two evils. Yeah, I know anti-Semitism is bad, but I'd rather that over my current scenario. So
yeah. By the way, I can fully understand how your father feels, because I grew up in a country which had systemic anti-Semitism, like from above, and you could be beaten up on your way to a metro station, 5-minute walk, because you were Jewish. I mean, that was my first 18 years, so I can understand what it means. Luckily, my children grew up without that. And so for them, it's much more difficult. Most Israelis grew up, they don't understand what it means when people look at you and say, you are bad. I don't like you. Why don't you like me? Did I do anything? No, because you are who you are. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. And so these things are hard for Israelis to understand. So anti-Semitism, unless it's manifested very, very vocally and very explosively, like it did over the last year, it is no deterrent over a long time. Long term, not deterrent for exit. And you have places that are not, you now have a big community of Israelis in Cyprus, 40-minute flight from Tel Aviv. You can, if you are high tech, think about a high tech guy making $200,000-$300,000 a year, okay? So he can now, he or she can just relocate to Limassol, okay? The same climate, the same sea. Their taxes will drop about 40%. The real estate is low. They will sell real estate here, buy real estate there, get a golden visa for 10 years, and live and send their children to Israeli school, which is opened in a year and a half, last year and a half. Okay? And they're basically going to save about, over the next 5 years, they're going to be saving about $1 million for their children, inheritance, 5-7 years. Okay? So you say to this, and there's no reserve duty, there is no fighting and going and being upset, etc. You can visit your parents and your friends every other weekend for $100 round trip. Okay, so basically easier to get to Tel Aviv than from Jerusalem. So how do you explain to that person that that's not something that they want to do and sit this one out? Okay, but in the minute that, and Cyprus doesn't have anti-Semitism, at least not in the Greek side.
Right. I mean,
okay, so how do you? There was, by the way, before October 7th, when the judicial reform was being pushed through, people were already discussing with some countries a relocation of 100 to 200,000 people from high tech as a group. There was real conversations with 3 countries, and then October 7th hit, and everybody came back and started fighting, etc. So that was it. That is not something. This happens if 200,000 people of high tech leave. We've basically done. We have very little to offer.
So
apart from that.
So Eugene, but let me try to take it to what we can do a little bit, Izzy, to your question, and try to bring back a little bit of that hope. So I think when we started Israel Strategic Futures Institute, that was really the premise of it. How do we take these concepts and how do we reclaim our ownership about our future in Israel? Granted, I understand, not living in Israel, I have a lot of that's a loaded issue for me, but I'm doing what I can from here. Anyway, we understood that we really need to be moving forward and looking, first of all, and this is why we were founded. We wanted to raise the alarm and look at the problems, straight in the eyes. What are the issues? And Eugene mentioned them. We have the deterioration of the social fabric because of the diversity of. So there's a social collapse that's happening. There's an economic collapse that's happening because of the lack of fiscal responsibility in different groups in Israel. And there's a security risk, which is the reality of Israel. It goes up, it goes down. The reality of Israel, unfortunately, hopefully this won't be forever, but is that there is a security, national security risk. So every time that we're a little bit weaker or we go through a cycle where we aren't as strong, we are attacked. It is seen as an opportunity and a weakness.
You're saying socially or politically, like at any type of weakness leaves room for.
We believe so. Any type of weakness is an opportunity.
Oh, we don't have to believe. It's the stated policy of Iranian government to make us weaker, causing some people to leave, the stronger populations to leave, and then we will be weaker, and then we will fold with some help from outside. That's the stated policy of Iran, of Hezbollah, of Hamas. So this is not what we claiming. Is that we're basically fighting them every day, and yet internally we're helping them achieve their goal.
Right.
It's the paradox, but it's unfortunately true.
And the first step of it is to understand that, right? To understand that, and also understand that, with the security, we're not going to be able to influence Iran or its proxies. We of course can slow them down, but the ideology behind that is not going anywhere. What we can do is deal with our social economic challenges, and we believe that the fact that we have a government that is structurally incompetent right now is because of the structure of our demography, right, and where it's going. Meaning, our government and the governing structure today is the key to unlocking Israel's future.
I just want to make sure, Daniela, it doesn't mean that this specific coalition, this is not a question of this specific coalition, it's a structural issue. We may have issues with this specific coalition, but the issues, if it changes, the things that we're talking about are not going to go away anywhere.
Right. I mean, I think that's apparent given that the coalition, it's changed over and changed over and changed over, and you just come back to the same issues.
Yeah, but that's really an important point. It's not a political statement at all. It's not one leader or another. It's not one coalition or another. Unfortunately, it's a structural issue, or fortunately also, because what that means is it's within our power as a society, as Israel, and global Jewry, by the way, and we'll talk about that a little bit maybe, but it is within our power to address it. And so first, we were founded to look at the problem, understand and identify the problem. We always say that's a big part of the solution, right? And once we're able to do that, understand what are the conditions that are required, what are the characteristics of any solution that would be able to resolve some of these core issues. What does that look like? What are, the musts and what are the nice to haves? What are the systems and examples that exist outside of Israel? Things that have been done here in the US, in Europe, or anywhere in the world. What can we learn from and what can we bring to Israel to help us address similar challenges that, as special as we are, other countries have faced, and other countries have gone about solving them in different ways. And we started with the federal system in the US and how that allows more diverse population to live together and be able to still live amongst people with similar values. And last is not and not least is really to create the conditions within Israel that will allow such a change. So if when we started, the idea of structural change was a very radical idea when you think about it in Israel, I think we're seeing it becoming more and more normalized as a concept, which is a very, very, it's very positive progress. We're still, I think, a little bit, some of the alternatives are still seen when we look at structural change are still seen as radical, but again, they're coming more into mainstream, which is important. But we really need to drive the public and leadership to be ready for that kind of structural change and think about what that means. And so as an initiative, that's really what we're here to do. Sound the alarm, create hope, say there are solutions. It's been done in other places. It exists in the world, and we can bring those structural changes to Israel. And last but not least, of course, be the movement that prepares the ground in Israel for that change.
Just two quick points to basically support what Daniela just said. The conditions that she talked about is that we're saying, look, the current governance system, the unitary system that forces the laws on everybody, makes us fight for the right to write these laws. That's not going to end well. So we have to have a change in our governance system. And any change, any system must satisfy four conditions if it wants to address the challenges that we're facing. The first condition is basically live and let live. It basically says that every large group that wants to live according to its values should be able to do so under the protection of the law, which by definition means that some laws have to apply to some people and some laws have to apply to other people. We cannot have one law to govern two incompatible visions of the future, actually three incompatible.
Can you give an example of that, like where that might exist, possibly?
Well, Massachusetts and Oklahoma.
Okay.
They have different set of laws. Most of the laws that govern their day-to-day lives are very, very different.
Right. I think it's hard because we're not talking about in Israel. We're not going to break it down city by city. We're talking demographics.
No, I'm not talking city by city. I'm talking about the ability to large groups of people, because in the U.S. the people basically gravitate towards places they feel comfortable living. Okay, in Israel we don't have that. We do have that to some extent, but there is a big mix of people. So you can't say, well, we're going to take I don't know, Bnei Brak and call it Oklahoma. Okay, that's, it's too small. But the principle still has to apply. So live and let live, that's the first thing. The second thing, and live as you want, but pay for it. Basically, it says, look, if you choose a particular lifestyle, you cannot say it's my lifestyle, but I can't afford it, so you're going to pay for it. Imagine that people say, well, I want to buy a house in Malibu, but I can't afford it, so I want you to pay for my house in Malibu. It's not going to work, right? I mean, it's just never works. You can see, look, I'm handicapped. I need some support. So I will get some support from the pool of money that goes to welfare support. But if people say, look, this is how I want to live, and I can't afford it, so you're going to pay for it. It's a large group. That's not going to work. 3, we have to have a government whose main goal is to provide services and care about the citizens of the country rather than trying to achieve political goals. That's just has to be. I mean, we're not in the region where we can afford to have ineffective and incompetent government structure. And the 4th is the most important, is that we have to make sure that the rules of the game that we agree upon today cannot be changed by a small majority or coalition with a small majority tomorrow. That is, we are in the position where we, in one session of Knesset, we make more modification to our basic laws, which is sort of substitute for constitution, than the entire U.S. history. And U.S. history is 22 amendments, I think. We're making many more amendments every session of the Knesset. Okay? In every time, in every direction. And it's just enough 61 members of the Knesset, and you can do whatever you want. That's ridiculous. I mean, you can't live with the rules of the game where you basically today, you go and you're playing soccer, and tomorrow the same field you're playing basketball. And you have to decide, we're playing soccer, we're playing basketball. You can adapt to either one of them, but you can't say, well, today we're coming in to play soccer and suddenly it's basketball. I mean, it's just that cannot work. So these four conditions, it's very important. And then the last point I want to make is the role of the world Jewry in this. And since American Jewry is the biggest Jewry in the world, the biggest Jewish population in the world, but French Jewry and British Jewry and Australian Jewry and Argentinian Jewry, all very important. We are in this pot being cooked. Okay, we're like these frogs in the pot, and some of the frogs don't really understand that they're being cooked, and some of the frogs are fighting within the pot. Okay, and who's going to determine the temperature at which we're being boiled? The problem is that we have very few people from within Israel who can put a mirror in front of us. We're trying to do that, but you immediately being labeled as affiliated with some political side. We're no longer able to listen to people's arguments. We immediately find whether he is with us or against us. So the world Jewry can actually put a mirror in our face and say, guys, this is our country as well. You are destroying it. It's not a political issue. It's not. A lot of Jews around the world are hesitant to intervene in Israeli politics. This is not politics. This is survival of the country. This is your country, no less than it's my country. It was established for all Jews in the world. So think about it as you have an option on this country, and I have a share in this country because I've already exercised my option. Financially speaking. Okay, so it's your country, no less. And if that country disappears, you're going to suffer. Because now you won't have, apart from all the good things that you can say about this country, you will not have an option to leave the place where you persecuted and go to a safe home. That is worth a lot. And so the world Jewry has to wake up and say, guys, you basically screwing up the place which we all created together. Like you said, it's not, when things happen here, you hear them there, or you feel them there. And when things happen there, we feel them here. We're not separated. More and more, we are disconnecting because a lot of Jews don't like the government at all. And so they disconnect from Israel. The other part of the Jews love Israel so much that they say we can't criticize the government because it means criticizing Israel. We're saying, look, guys, let's all unite and try to save the country from disintegrating. That's the message. And it's not political. So queasiness about intervening in internal affairs, these are not internal affairs. Disappearance of this country is not internal affairs of Israelis.
You would equate it almost with, the same way post October 7th, and really always, and I come from a community that no matter what supported the IDF and made sure that physically, structurally, in that sense, Israel was always supported. So you would say this is unequivocally the same thing. As much as you're going to stand up and support the Chayalim when they need to physically, because right now that's also still a lot of people's focus, and we know we just now shifted into a whole other stage of things. So, are we asking? I'll leave it at that. Is it the same? Is it different? What are the nuances?
It is the same because, look, if we have a significant immigration from Israel, the people who will immigrate are the most productive populations because these are the people who have opportunities outside.
Elsewhere.
The next wave after that, because that will take a chunk of tax revenues out of Israel and create a big hole, which will necessitate cutting both the welfare state, which supports all these communities, and defense. and also will cut into health and education, etc. We just saw the government basically cutting 3 billion shekels out of health, education, etc., and then giving some of the similar amounts to its coalition partners to keep the coalition. So this is going to be happening on much, much larger scale when they don't have and they're regardless of which government it is. So the next group who will face this burden, so it will face much higher taxes, much lower services, less defense, more reserve duty. They will say, okay, now it's my turn. I can't deal with this anymore. So there will be spiral, and this spiral can be pretty quick. It could be 1 or 2 years when the country becomes completely unsustainable. And so the way the country becomes unsustainable, like Daniela said, it's going to be attacked. And you will not have the intelligence, and you will not have the sophisticated systems. You will not have airplanes because you can't afford them. Okay, flying F-15 for an hour costs $40,000 for an hour. Okay, running a tank for an hour costs several $1,000s. I mean, you have to have a lot of money to sustain it. But this economy basically coughed not more than that at the huge expense of the war. And if we were going forward and growing and everything was fine and we were not fighting, it would be a hiccup. Not, of course, not in human lives, etc., but in terms of economics. It will reduce our growth by a few portions of percentage point over the next decade. We would still grow and be one of the richest countries in the world per capita. But now we're going to the abyss. And that has to be prevented, and somebody has to look us in the eyes and say, guys, here's what you're doing. And it's from outside, it looks much clearer. And unfortunately, that's what we're trying to tell people in the world, whether it's in France or UK or US. Guys, look at this not with eyes of I don't want to deal with you anymore, or with eyes that anything you say is fine. Look at this at the eyes that you love the place, love the people, but you are concerned about the outcomes of where we're going. That is the voice that is missing.
And if I could add, and again, I think one could claim that the marginal impact of another dollar going into the military support, depending on when, I'm not gonna say anything about when everything was happening during October 7th and the months thereafter, but if you look at it today, I think the real risk that no one is financing yet. We're really based on volunteers primarily in all our work, and people that believe in this and the future from within Israel. But the marginal impact of another dollar to the military versus another dollar to look at this, what really could be the main driver for the non-existence of Israel in 15 years. The worst case scenario to all of us. I think there's a moment in time right now where the marginal value.
There's no comparison.
Yeah, it's just, yeah.
And the interesting thing is that when you donate money to the IDF, in many cases, you basically covering for the incompetence of the government, of the military, which did not. I mean, having 50,000 or 100,000 ceramic vests, was crazy that the military didn't have them. They cost less than one helicopter or two helicopters, and they have not having. So you basically the world jury covers for the Israeli government incompetencies in many cases, or lack of desire to invest in hospitals, in universities, etc. Whereas this thing, the government cannot do. It has to be forced on the government to realize, to the politician to realize that there's no escape. And so that's, in some sense, it's a much more popular support, volunteering, speaking, supporting it financially. And we, all of us, work pro bono and will continue doing that. This is not for us. This is for creating campaigns and popular movements to demand a, a change to a system which will allow us to live side by side as brothers, as compatriots, without fearing each other, without hating each other, without defending our children from each other. Because that country that is currently called Israel, we are living in fear of each other. We're living in continuous fighting, where it's Kaplan, where it's what's going in the Knesset, where it's firing the people. We are fighting. It's a fight over values. And that fight cannot, nobody can win this fight. We can only lose together.
I think, yeah, and I think ultimately what I always remind myself of, and gives me a little bit of hope, even as you have these conversations, you see, wow, all the disparities, is that at the end of the day, and you mentioned that, Eugene, a while back, right, that even, there has been immigration of Israelis outside of Israel for some time, obviously, but everybody came back at the end of the day when it came to ensuring the security and safety of the country. And we've heard this over and over, and I think it gives us all a little boost of strength, is that ultimately, push comes to shove, everybody came back to make sure that their brothers and sisters were okay, that even the guy that they didn't know, when it gets to that point, but we don't want to get to that point again, where that's when it wakes us up. And I think that's what you're doing, and what you're putting the mirror in front of the face to say, we don't need to get to this point where then you're fighting for the survival. Let's do it from a place of strength, which right now, okay, you could argue maybe Israel's not, in its strongest place, but, and we can do something practical. And I also always, I was taken aback when I would watch or when you see any of the protests happening. Regardless, I'm not getting to the nitty gritty, but ultimately, people are there because they are trying to ensure a future, and they're standing there with an Israeli flag, no matter what side they're on. And I think that is a unique point. I think that is something to hold on to recognize internally as you go forward with this mission, that really you're talking about values. Yes, the value, the specificities of the value that I live and carry out within my home, versus what you both might hold out is different. But ultimately, we're having this conversation that, there's many things you said that I wouldn't necessarily agree with or hold count with, but I can still sit here and have a conversation with you and agree at the end of this conversation that we have the same goal. And that goal is to ensure the continuity of the state of Israel, to ensure the continuity of the Jewish people around the world, and to do so where everybody feels like they're winning. And I think that's the power of what you are able to do with this platform. Please God. And
that's exactly, you summarized it much better than we could. It's
that was after
exactly
listening to it for an hour, it helped me.
That's we're happy that we are convincing, but it requires a lot of work. What we're trying to do is to create ripples for people like you, other people that create in their communities the ripples around the concept that we cannot be complacent, that this country is a gift from God, from serendipity, 2,000 years of struggle. It doesn't matter. It's a gift, and this gift is not been promised to us. It was promised to us, but not unconditional. If we screw it up third time, we might never have it again, and that may result in a dramatic decline in the Jewish people as well.
Before we close out, I'm just watching. I can keep talking and asking a lot more questions, but just to really leave us on a practical note, and hopefully an inspirational note, if you could briefly touch on what's been happening already in Israel in regards to this movement and platform that you're building, and then very quickly, other than financial needs, what the actual, you mentioned something about, ripple effects here in the diaspora. Like, what are you actually asking and calling upon the diaspora community to do in regards to this? Maybe if each of you...
Daniela, you want to answer that?
Sure. I think to quickly cover some of the things that are happening in Israel, we basically have both a public strategy where we are publishing op-eds, interviews, podcasts. We're trying to put this idea of understanding and agreeing together on the challenges and what are the core conditions, as Eugene mentioned before, of the solutions, making that more of a public conversation, but also within smaller, closed leadership groups within Israel. Business leaders, religious leaders, and others, having those conversations with them, but also publishing and continuing the conversation in the public. We're also working with, we're very blessed to have many volunteers that are taking this conversation forward and bringing these concepts to their networks, to their surroundings. Just having those conversations, again, we don't need to be in every room to make sure that this conversation, as Eugene said, has ripple effects. And similarly, I think with the Jewish community outside of Israel, we found that I think there is less of a recognition that the real risks right now are internal, and that is, I think, first and foremost, the most important thing that we want to raise awareness and have these conversations with us, invite us, have them within within the networks, have this conversation about what are the threats to Israel and what's happening internally, and we're happy to be a resource to help educate and help expose more groups to what is happening on the ground. And then take responsibility, think about how you can be active, again, not only financially in creating this conversation and creating the right pressure and the right coalitions to drive this change forward. We believe that it's going to be an effort of everyone from every direction. There's not one clear strategy moving forward in terms of this person or this politician. It's a platform play, right? It's a broad strategy where we're attacking it on every single front. We need to have these conversations top down, bottom up, side to side, to make this move forward. So I think the most important call to action would be to have these conversations. And again, we're more than happy to help facilitate, join virtually, in person, whatever, for more advanced conversations if there's interest. Eugene, would you like to?
Yeah, I just want to add something. A lot of Israeli politicians come to the United States for support, for financial support, for other types of support, for lectures, etc. There's got to be a demand to give something back. Okay, well, the Jewish communities are helping Israel. They're helping politicians. What are you asking in return? The minimal that you can ask in return is to make sure that this country will not disappear. And that requires that the system is changed so people no longer live in a war. And that's a minimal demand from politicians. That's what we're trying to do with the Israeli voters. Because Israeli voters who vote for a party, we tell them, look, we're not telling you whom to vote for. We're just asking you to demand something in return for your vote. And that something is a very, very minimal thing, that you have to ensure that my grandchildren have a country. And I don't care whether I'm Haredi or whether I'm secular, whether I'm religious, whether I'm Arab. I want my grandchildren to have a country. And I want that country to be Israel. And I want it to be strong and prosperous and secure. And in order to get that, you have to change the system of governance that will allow us, instead of fighting with each other, to collaborate on making this country the best it can be. That is so. The same call. We are basically asking the Jewish communities around the world to say to us, you are there to protect, to take care of our country. It's your country, but it's also ours. We're helping you, but in return of helping you, you need to ensure that this country exists.
Right. So I could spend a lot more time also just, and I can think, I feel like I need a whole other conversation to dive into the intricacies of how this structural change would work and be implemented and all of that. And I think where we'll leave it for now is just really, like I mentioned before, this idea that we all are really striving towards the same goal and the same solution, and we're taking the achrayas, the responsibility. You both are very much taking the achrayas and responsibility to do something about it in real time. I'll just mention quickly, because it did stick out to me when I first heard you speak a few months back, when I've mentioned to people the timeline, the trajectory, and the projection that you've outlined. Granted, I don't necessarily understand where that number came from. I'm sure, based on your experience and your understanding of economics and the society at large, it's not just a random number. But when I mentioned, 10, 15 years to people, it's just, no, where do you even come up? No, there's no way. It's not even, even if I said that there could potentially be a point in time where we're really facing, other than an external threat, an internal threat that would lead to such a trajectory, people are just completely floored and just in disbelief. So there's a lot of work to be done. I hope that
a lot of people are in denial.
Sure. No, because look, at the end of the day, we need to hold on to hope. And when there is so much externally that is beating us down, I do think, and I will strongly believe that if we lead with the light and with the solution, that then the problems you will be able to work through the problems. So, I just hope that you both have the strength to continue going forward and holding on to the solution that you've put forth for now. And if it needs to change and evolve and move and shift, that you should have the strength to do so as well, and have the right people in your army per se, to keep forging ahead. And for all of us, that we should have the strength to do what we need to do in a time that calls on us to do something, I think. So yeah.
Thank you, Izzy.
Izzy, just to recognize the importance of this conversation as well, and you taking an active role. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to give us a like and subscribe on YouTube. And if you have any ideas of who we should sit down with from across the aisle, please be sure to reach out and let us know. Until next time.